In the autumn of 1884, somewhere along the rugged frontier of Arizona Territory, the evening sun was sinking behind distant mesas when cowboy Ethan Cole guided his tired horse along a lonely trail. He had spent the day checking cattle on the edge of his ranch and was eager to reach home before darkness settled over the valley. The frontier was quiet, but Ethan had learned never to trust that silence. As he rode between two lines of weathered rocks, he suddenly heard something unusual, a faint cry carried by the cold wind. He pulled the reins, listened carefully, and heard it again. Someone was calling for help nearby. Ethan dismounted and tied his horse beside a scrubby tree before following the sound on foot. The trail led him toward an abandoned mining site that had been deserted years earlier. Old wooden beams stood crooked around a deep shaft, half covered by sand and dry brush. Ethan approached carefully and looked down. At the bottom, he saw a young Apache woman sitting against the rocky wall. Her clothing was dusty from the journey, and one arm was protecting an injured ankle. She looked up immediately when Ethan appeared above her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Her expression showed fear and uncertainty. Ethan slowly stepped away from the edge so she would not feel threatened. "Easy," he said calmly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The young woman remained silent, watching every movement he made. Ethan noticed that she was exhausted and had probably been trapped there for hours. He removed the rope from his saddle, secured it around a strong wooden beam, and lowered the other end into the shaft. "Hold on tightly," he explained. "I'll pull you up." After a moment of hesitation, she wrapped her hands around the rope. Ethan pulled steadily, stopping whenever she needed to regain her strength. Finally, he helped her over the edge. The woman stood carefully, testing her injured ankle before taking a few uncertain steps. Ethan offered her his canteen, but she hesitated again. He placed it on a nearby rock and stepped back. After a moment, she picked it up and drank slowly. "My name is Ethan," he said. "What's yours?" She looked toward the mountains before answering quietly. "Nayeli." Ethan repeated the name respectfully and nodded. Nayeli explained that she had become separated from her people after a violent storm swept across the region. She had been traveling with them when frightened horses scattered, leaving her alone. While searching for the group, she had fallen into the abandoned shaft. Ethan looked toward the western horizon. Darkness was approaching quickly, and the surrounding country could become dangerous after sunset. "You can't travel alone tonight," he said. Nayeli watched him carefully, unsure whether she could trust him. Ethan understood her hesitation. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. He removed a piece of dried food from his saddlebag and placed it beside the canteen. Then he pointed toward the distant hills. "I'll help you find your people," he promised. Nayeli studied his face, searching for any sign that he meant something else. Instead of leaving, Ethan gathered a few supplies from his horse. He made a simple walking support from a branch and cloth so Nayeli could protect her injured ankle. He also offered her his spare blanket as the temperature began to fall. Nayeli accepted it without a word. For the first time, the tension in her expression softened slightly. Ethan then checked the surrounding trail for signs of danger. The abandoned mine was too exposed to remain overnight. He suggested moving toward a small cabin several miles away, a place he sometimes used during cattle drives. Nayeli followed cautiously, keeping several steps behind him. They had barely reached the narrow trail leading away from the mine when Ethan stopped suddenly. His horse raised its head and gave a nervous snort. Ethan listened. At first, there was nothing but the wind moving through the dry grass. Then came the unmistakable sound of distant hoofbeats. Nayeli turned toward the valley, her expression changing immediately. Ethan motioned for her to stay behind the rocks while he watched the approaching riders. Several dark figures were moving across the ridge in the fading light. Ethan could not yet tell who they were, but something about their presence made him uneasy. He reached for his rifle, knowing the night had just become far more dangerous. Ethan's expression changed the moment Nayeli spoke those words. He looked down at the small silver pendant hanging from his saddle, then back at her. For years, he had carried it without knowing its meaning. He had found it near an old trail after a dangerous cattle drive, believing it was simply something a traveler had lost. "I never knew who it belonged to," Ethan said quietly. "I found it near Red Willow Creek about 3 years ago." Nayeli stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the pendant. She explained that the symbol belonged to her father, a respected member of her community. He had worn it for many years before disappearing during a difficult journey. Nayeli had always hoped he was still alive, but no one had known what had happened to him. Ethan suddenly remembered something else. Near the same place where he found the pendant, he had discovered the remains of an old campsite. There had been broken arrows, a torn blanket, and fresh horse tracks leading toward the northern hills. At the time, Ethan had never understood what had happened there. "I may know where your family went," he told Nayeli. Before they could discuss it further, a gunshot echoed somewhere beyond the canyon. Both of them froze. The armed riders had found their trail. Ethan quickly extinguished the small lantern inside the cabin and motioned for Nayeli to stay low. Outside, horses moved across the ground. The riders were searching carefully, calling to one another as they approached. Ethan knew they could not remain in the cabin. He quietly opened the rear door and led Nayeli toward a narrow trail hidden behind the building. The path climbed into the hills, where the rocky terrain made tracking difficult. They moved slowly until the sound of the riders disappeared behind them. By sunrise, Ethan and Nayeli had reached a sheltered valley. From the ridge, Ethan noticed several old tracks leading north. Nayeli recognized the direction immediately. "My people traveled this way," she said. Ethan nodded. "Then we'll follow them." For the next 2 days, they traveled carefully through the Arizona wilderness. Ethan shared his food and water, while Nayeli used her knowledge of the land to identify trails, plants, and distant landmarks. The two strangers gradually developed a quiet understanding. Ethan never treated her as helpless, and Nayeli began to trust him because he listened when she spoke. On the 3rd morning, they discovered the remains of an old campsite beside a stream. Nayeli stopped. She recognized the place. There were marks carved into a weathered tree, symbols used by her people to guide travelers toward safety. Her family had passed through there. Ethan searched the ground and found another clue beneath a flat stone, a piece of worn leather carrying the same symbol as the silver pendant. Nayeli held it carefully and realized her family had left the trail only a short time earlier. They followed the markings until they reached a distant Apache camp near the foothills. When the people at the camp saw Nayeli approaching, several rushed forward. Her family members had feared that she was lost forever. The reunion was emotional, but Ethan remained at a respectful distance, allowing Nayeli to return to her people. After some time, Nayeli came back to him. "You kept your promise," she said. Ethan smiled. "I only helped you find the road." Nayeli looked toward the pendant in his hand. "You helped me find more than that." Before Ethan left, Nayeli's father approached him and explained that the pendant had been lost years earlier during a difficult journey. Ethan finally understood why the small piece of silver had seemed important even before he knew its story. The cowboy returned to his ranch several days later, expecting life to return to normal. But it didn't. Weeks later, while Ethan was repairing a fence, he saw a familiar figure riding toward his property. It was Nayeli. She had returned with a message from her family and a small gift for the man who had refused to leave her alone in the wilderness. Ethan smiled as she approached. Their meeting had begun with fear, uncertainty, and a forgotten pendant. But what shocked Ethan most was not the mystery he had uncovered. It was the friendship and trust that had grown between two people who, under very different circumstances, might never have met at all.